and welcome to City Breaks Marseille, Episode 7. I'm Marion Jones. I've struggled a little bit with the title for this episode because it's a bit of a mix of things. In the end, the shortest I can come up with is boat trips, beaches and the Chateau d'If, which I think does summarise the content to come. Based on the thinking that if you spend a day or two in Marseille, and certainly if you're there for any longer, you are definitely going to want to at least do a boat trip and or visit one of the nearby beaches. So this episode is really a summary of ideas for days out. In fact, they're all pretty close this time, so you could even think of them as half days out. Although I think they are all places where it would be nice to linger if you have the time. So then, a range of ideas for boat trips and beaches to visit, and excursions to one or two not very far away places, LinksThe, which is practically a suburb of Marseille really, and Cassis, which is just a few kilometres up the coast, plus an idea for a scenic train ride along said coast, and of course, the story of the Chateau d'If and the Count of Monte Cristo. So I'm going to start with boat trips, because une promenade en mer, as I've seen it so nicely described in French, is going to strike you as a good idea as soon as you look out from the old port. A spot of sunshine and sea, a little breeze perhaps if you're lucky, magnificent views both back at the city of Marseille itself and ahead out to sea. Surely you'll want to do at least one of the options, which fall really into two categories. So there are trips out to the Frioul archipelago, which can be done in as little time as an hour if you go straight there and back. And the alternative then would be a boat trip to see the Calanques, so the narrow coves with high cliffs which are all along the coast between Marseille and Cassis. A slightly longer trip on average, although of course it does depend whether you get off the boat and how long you stay. So out to Frioul then, 4 kilometres or so from Marseille. You can be there in 20 minutes on a boat, and there are certainly regular shuttles every day of the week. Stopping off is an option, perhaps on one of the two smaller islands where you'll find footpaths, little creeks to swim in, and a selection of harbourside cafes and restaurants. More popular still is the idea of stopping off at the island of If, I-F, to see the Chateau d'If. That is one of the Frioul archipelago as well, popular partly because of the 360-degree view you'll get of Marseille and all the environs, and partly for its interesting history. When it moved in the 16th century from being just a wild island that the occasional fishermen stopped at, to somewhere that Francois I visited. And as soon as he got there, he could see that strategically it could be really important, sitting as it does just outside the harbour of Marseille, so he decreed that a fortification must be built there. I think he phrased it as something to protect the port of Marseille, although he soon realised it was a great place too for shutting away people who disagreed with him, state prisoners if you like, and plenty of future monarchs followed suit. The most famous prisoner is of course fictional, the Count of Monte Cristo, but plenty of real people were locked up here too. For example, 3,500 Protestants during the Wars of Religion in the 16th century, the revolutionaries from 1848, people who were unwise enough to oppose Napoleon III, citizens of Marseille in 1871, who staged an uprising in support of the Paris Commune, and, last of all, in the 20th century, German prisoners of war from World War I. So definitely a long, dark history. Today it's a monument, open to the public, attracting 90,000 visitors a year, somewhere where you can walk round the fortification and get lovely views of Marseille and the bay, somewhere where you can hear the story of the real prisoners there and the fictional one. You can visit, for example, the inner courtyard, the dungeons, the cells. In the courtyard you'll see inscriptions done by the prisoners from 1848. Dozens of stone tablets with names and dates on them, and wry comments, such as the one where somebody carefully inscribed the words Hôtel du Peuple Souverain, the Hotel of the Sovereign People, a reference to the fact that he had been locked up by the state. There are information boards to explain what you're looking at, such as the board describing the fate of the Protestant prisoners, 3,500 of them, remember, shut up here in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. They chose, says the explanation, chains, prison and death over renouncing their faith. One of the cells is mysteriously labelled, said to be the prison of the man in the iron mask. who was a real prisoner arrested in the reign of Louis XIV and forced to wear a mask to hide his identity. The words said to be indicate the fact that we don't really know whether he was actually here or not, even though we do know that he was held in various prisons and that he died in prison in Paris in the Bastille in November 1703. There are references to a number of colourful characters. I think my favourite might be the Count of Mirabeau, imprisoned here for a year in 1774, on the orders of his father, no less. He was quite a wild young man, apparently, sent to the army so that he could learn some discipline, whereupon he seduced the wife of the colonel, and his father was so horrified that he arranged for his son to be sent a lettre de cachet, so one of those letters which meant you could be arrested and imprisoned without trial. Doesn't seem to have really calmed him down, because the rest of his life was a very colourful affair. Let's say affairs, adventures, being a secret agent, being sentenced to death and then getting it revoked. In the middle of all that, he found time to write quite a lot. Things of his which are still read today would include the Lettre à Sophie, erotic collection of letters to his mistress, and another much more political one on the Lettre de cachet, so those letters that meant that you could be imprisoned without a trial. And, of course, the one that stuck the longest in the memory, Edmond Dantes, hero of the Count of Monte Cristo. Not then a real person at all, but that doesn't stop people coming out to the chateau and looking for his cell, which is duly labelled. I'm going to finish the episode with a couple of extracts from Alexandre Dumas's novel, but for the moment I'm going to move on to the other sort of boat trip, the one that takes you out to the Calanques. So along the coast to see the little inlets with the rocks rising up behind them, most of which you can only access either on foot or by boat. But they're very popular, 2 million visitors a year, partly because they're beautiful and partly also for the wildlife. Over 9,000 plant species growing there, and it's a breeding ground for rare birds, for example an eagle called the Bonelli eagle. It's all a national park these days, so a protected area with the kind of rules you'd expect. Don't light fires, don't smoke, no wild camping. And it is also the place where the Cosquet cave was discovered in 1991, so the underwater cave with all the artwork in it dating back 27,000 years. The one I mentioned in the episode on La Joliette. You won't see the cave as you pass in a boat, but you can visit the reproduction on La Joliette, the Cosquet Museum, which I think was actually my favourite museum in the whole of Marseille. I'll put a link in the notes to a site where you can do more research on the Calanques, find out all about the various boat trips. There's quite a variety. You can sail past on shorter or longer trips, or choose one which will allow you to get out at one or more of the coves and do a spot of swimming or sunbathing or snorkelling. There are one or two within walking distance of Marseille. The Calanques de Morgiou, for example, will take about an hour. Or if you're feeling really adventurous, you could try going to the Calanques de Sormiou, for which you'll have to take a metro and then a bus and then walk for an hour or so. You can drive there too. There is a car park at the top, but it belongs to a restaurant and I think you're expected to eat there, reasonably enough, if you're going to park there. The Sormiou Calanques, actually, I've seen described as one of the most Instagrammable spots in Marseille because it is a beauty. A little sandy, pebbly beach, a few cabanons, so little fishermen's cottages, and wonderful views, quite lyrically described actually on the Marseille tourism website. Listen to this. In the distant indentation of the hills, the sea shines, an azure blue that blends with the horizon. The white limestone of the massif is stained with the green of the garrigue and the pine trees, a real palette of 3 colours. So much then for boat trips. Let's move on to beaches, another defining feature of a trip to Marseille, I would say. This came home to me particularly when I came across an extract from a novel by a Marseille author called Rebecca Ligieri, in which she describes a little scene that must surely be a rite of passage for all Marseille teenagers. So it's set in the summer of 1994, when her main character was 16 and just beginning to explore outside the city centre and visit the port and the beaches and the various parks at Borelli and Longchamp. The scene dates, says the author, from Le deuxième été de notre amour, the second summer of our love, and it describes a crowd of teenagers going, as she puts it, from one beach to another on the bus. So think raffia shoulder bags, the girls with swimming costumes under their dresses, the boys wearing a splash of eau de toilette, Imagine the scene every time the bus lurches round a corner when the teenagers fall into each other, and it's all very exciting. So you too will surely want to visit at least one of the beaches, and there are about 20 beaches to choose from. Big ones, little ones, some with lifeguards, some with lockers and toilets and showers. Something for everyone, really. So just to run through a few of the options, the closest one to the old harbour is La Plage des Catalans, called, I think, because Catalans settled here in the 17th century. Anyway, it's a sandy beach, which not all Marseille's beaches are, so a good one to visit. Very popular for that reason, and also, of course, because it's so close. And just along the coast from that, La Plage du Prophète, so the Prophet's Beach, just along past the end of the Corniche Kennedy. Also very popular with families and locals in the daytime, and particularly in the evenings, a bit of a beach party for young people. Then there's a parc balnéaire, so an actual resort called the Prado, 5 kilometres of coastline, popular with fishermen and joggers, and set just about 100 metres back from the beach, something more unusual, the Musée Subaquatique, the Underwater Museum, which is a collection of statues. I think there are 8 or 10 there currently, about 5 metres down. So works of art, yes, but also there to, quote, raise awareness of marine biology. It's free to visit, and you're free to do so if you think you know what you're doing. If you don't, you might prefer to go on an accompanied visit, where, if necessary, you'll be lent the equipment that you'll need. A little bit further along again, one that's a good idea for a family day out, I would say, the Plage Borelli. It's a pebble beach, but it's just off the coast next to the Parc Borelli, with its beautiful rose garden and botanical garden and lots of things for kids. You can do little boat trips, roundabouts and whatnot. A chateau there with the Museum of Decorative Arts, so all of that, but the beach close by too. And just lastly to mention the Plage de la Pointe Rouge, where the red rocks are, a fine sandy beach, shallow water, so again popular with families, somewhere where you can windsurf or do some paddle boating, and restaurants that will knock you up a pizza or some barbecue food. I wanted to mention too somewhere called l'Estac, which is 10 kilometres or so from the centre of Marseille. Used to be an old fishing village. These days it's part of Marseille, really, the 16th arrondissement, I believe. So somewhere very close, but with its own flavour. It's said that the people who live there are Estaciens first and Marseillais second. And it's a sheltered little spot, billed as being between the sea and the hills. And sheltered is quite good on any day when the Mistral is about, the famous wind that blows through this part of the country. Strange name, l'Estac, comes from the Provençal word estaco, which apparently means a stake to which you would moor your boat. So there's a clue to its history as a fishing village, which was originally completely separate from Marseille, joined just by a mule track. But it got bigger, particularly at the end of the 19th century, when various factories arrived, a tile factory particularly, and it grew into more of an industrial area. But still a beautiful spot, popular with the artists. Renoir, for example, called it the most beautiful place in the world. And Cézanne, as mentioned in the art episode, rented a house here and painted many, many pictures of the sea at l'Estac and the village and the scenery visible from it. And a different claim to fame, it was also the place where Jacques Cousteau set up a marine research centre, still there today. Today you will find the factories have largely gone. It's quite an upmarket area now, really. Definitely a village feel with a square where you'll find the church and Cézanne's house and views of the harbour. A nice place to spend a day, really. You can come here to swim, to enjoy the harbour. If it's Saturday morning, you'll find a market. No shortage of restaurants with sea views. Some pretty botanical gardens. An interesting place called the Estac Jousting Club, home of a Provençal tradition which involves jousting on small boats, so trying to push other people off into the water with long poles. Taken very seriously here. I read that even national jousters come here to train. There's something called La Promenade des Peintres, so the artist's walk, signposted from the port, just on the jetty, and if you do the whole thing, it'll take you a couple of hours. A nice stroll around the whole of the area, enjoying the views that various artists painted, perhaps even musing about what you yourself might like to paint. On the subject of coastal things to do near Marseille, another idea is to take the Train de la Côte Bleu, a train. I think it might be a normal train, but it's very good for tourists because it goes all along the coast. You can buy a ticket from Marseille to Miramas. I think you can buy a special pass which allows you to get on and off as often as you like, and there are 15 stations to pass through. If you did the whole thing in one go, I think it's an hour and 15 minutes, with plenty of picture postcard type views out of the window of sand and sea. And places where you could get off would include Niolan, good for diving apparently, and Martigues, a little port known locally as the Provençal version of Venice. And a last idea for a day out which is really not very far at all, about 20 kilometres or so, and where you will see something very lovely at the other end, and that's a day trip to Cassis, which you can do both by train or bus, or of course drive yourself, and where you will find a charming little port. Think cobbled streets, a beach, boat trips, fishermen's cottages, plenty of little workshops and galleries to browse, cafes and restaurants, of course, a market every Wednesday and Friday, and in the summer also evening markets at the port, where artists from the area, engravers and whatnot, set up stalls to sell their work. So definitely something to visit if you're hoping to take home any sort of arty souvenir. Particularly appropriate, of course, in Cassis, which has long attracted artists who love to paint the cypress trees and pine forests, the Calanques, the port, views of Cassis itself. One of the very well-known paintings would be by Paul Signac, called simply La Calanque, and painted in 1906. I think Signac was Paris-based, but he loved Cassis, came here quite often, loved to sail, and painted a number of pictures with a maritime theme, of his yacht, for example. And if you are in Cassis for any longer than just a lunchtime, two other places you might choose to visit: the Museum of Art and Popular Traditions, quite small but free, somewhere where you can see art and Roman finds, and secondly, a little old fisherman's cottage called the Four Banal, which I think meant communal oven, built in the 17th century, so that other locals who didn't have an oven at home could come here to bake their bread. It lay undiscovered for centuries, but was found in 2001, set up to show, as far as anyone knows, what it would have looked like when it was actually operating, and makes a nice little place to pop into if you're passing. So, between the boat trips and the beaches, and the visits to very local places like LinksThe and Cassis, there is no shortage of ideas for days out from Marseille. But I want to finish the episode by going back to the idea of the Count of Monte Cristo, one of the very best-known things about the whole area. Even though he wasn't real, he was imagined. One of the features of the Chateau d'If, apart from the room they've labelled as possibly the cell occupied by Edmond Dantès, who went on to become the Count of Monte Cristo, is an exhibition, so a separate room there all about the author and the novel. It's quite extensive. I'll just do a very quick summary here. So it tells you about the author himself, born in 1802, one of the 19th century's most popular authors. I think probably his most famous book would be either The Count of Monte Cristo or possibly The Three Musketeers. Both blockbusters. My version of The Count of Monte Cristo, for example, runs to 1,243 pages, and both swashbuckling adventure stories, which I think it would be fair to say have been read by every generation since. Or at least everyone's seen at least one of the films. The Count of Monte Cristo, then, was published actually in series, a bit at a time, a bit like the way Dickens used to work, and it was set in a very turbulent period of French history, 1814 to 30, which is known as the Bourbon Restoration, so the monarchy trying to get back into power after the fall of Napoleon. And the first really dramatic event at the start of the novel is when Edmond Dantès, who's travelling the country on the evening before his wedding, is arrested and accused of being a Bonapartist. It's not true. I think the authorities know that actually, but they imprison him anyway in, where else, the Chateau d'If, where he languishes for 14 long years, before doing something which, as far as we know, no real person ever did manage, and that was staging an escape. That's right at the beginning of the 1,200 pages, and the plot is super complex, so let me just say it involves a squillion more adventures, treasure hidden on an island, revenge, Dantès becoming the Count of Monte Cristo, and so on. I enjoyed the summary I saw in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, part of which reads like this. The ingenious plot involves concealment and revelation, use of poisonous herbs, and all manner of other things. Beyond the exciting narrative, Dumas focused on the corrupt financial, political and judicial world of France at the time of the Bourbon Restoration. And so, to finish then, a couple of short readings from the chapter in which Dantes makes his escape. So he's been stuck in this desolate prison all this time. He's made friends with a neighbour, the Abbé Faria, an elderly man, and when Faria dies, that's the moment when Dantes can put a plan into action which will get him out of here. So he removes the corpse of the old man from the sacking that it's wrapped in, replaces it with himself, gets in, hides, so that the guards will come along in the evening and take what they believe to be the dead body out of the cell and toss it over the cliff into the sea. Dantes has had the foresight to take a knife with him, so he'll be able to tear his way out of the sacking and escape. Here then is how Dumas describes the moment when the two jailers come to collect the corpse. Quote, "The footsteps, 2 sets of them, stopped outside the door. Dantes guessed that this must be the 2 gravediggers who had come to fetch him. This suspicion became a certainty when he heard the noise that they made setting down the bier. The door opened, and a muffled light reached Dantes' eyes. Through the cloth covering him, he saw 2 shapes approach the bed. At the door was a third carrying a lantern. The 2 who had come over to the bed each grasped one end of the sack. 'He's still pretty heavy, this one, for such a thin old man,' said one, raising the head. 'They do say that each year adds a pound to the weight of the bones,' the other replied, taking the feet." And the story continues, and they struggle out of the cell with this heavy burden, along the stone corridor past the other cells, and outside, on their way to the cliff top. Quote, "They took about 50 paces, then stopped to open a gate before carrying on. The sound of waves breaking against the rocks on which the castle was built reached Dantes more and more clearly as they went on. 'The weather is bad,' said one of the men. 'I'd not like to be out at sea tonight.' 'Yes, the abbé runs a serious risk of getting wet,' said the other, and they burst out laughing. Dantes did not entirely understand this joke, but the hair still rose on his neck. 'Good, here we are,' said the first man. 'Further on, said the other. 'You remember that the last one stayed behind, caught on the rocks, and the next day the governor told us what lazy devils we were.' They took 4 or 5 steps more, still going up. Then Dantes felt them take him by the head and feet and swing him. 'One,' said the gravediggers. 2, 3. At this moment Dantes felt himself being thrown into a huge void, flying through the air like a wounded bird, then falling in a terrifying descent that froze his heart. Although he was drawn downwards by some weight that sped his flight, it seemed to him that the fall lasted a century. Finally, with a terrifying noise, he plunged like an arrow into icy water, and he cried out, his cry instantly stifled by the water closing around him. Dantes had been thrown into the sea, and a 36-pound cannonball tied to his feet was dragging him to the bottom. The sea is the graveyard of the Château d'If. Well, that's the end of the chapter, I'm afraid. You'll have to read the rest of the book to find out what happens, but I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that he does manage to rip his way out of the sack and swim to the shore, where a whole lot of new adventures begin. That then brings this episode to a close, so just a couple of things to mention. Do have a look at the blog if you have a moment, where you'll find a summary of each episode, including this one, and lots of pictures, and all the links you'll need to follow up the things that I've mentioned. We're coming slowly towards the end of the Marseille series, just 3 episodes to go. The last 2 are going to have literary themes, but before that, episode 8, next time, is going to be called Food and Shopping. I have a feeling it might major on food, but there's certainly quite a lot of interesting things to say about both those topics, so I hope you'll join me for them. Meanwhile, though, thank you very much for listening today. Merci bien pour l'écoute, and goodbye. Au revoir.